Are the occupiers, trying to achieve any specific goals now before winter comes?
They are occupiers, and their armed forces continue to carry out the objectives of their strategic offensive operation, which they have been conducting since the end of 2023 and up to the present, aimed at advancing and seizing our territories. That is why there are heavy battles on all fronts to resist this and disrupt their plans, and essentially to buy time so that the leadership of our allies, including the Americans and to some extent the Chinese, would have the opportunity to influence changes in this situation, to halt the fighting and move toward a ceasefire. Putin has different goals, and this is how he is trying to achieve them. That is why fighting of varying intensity is taking place on all fronts. And for example, by the number of assaults in these different sectors, you can understand where and how intense all of this is. That's why in recent months, and this remains the case for now, the main focus has been on the fighting around the Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad agglomeration, where the enemy is trying to physically close these pincers, so to speak, encircling the area. Pokrovsk itself and Myrnohrad as well. The main goal is, first and foremost, to halt logistical support, which has already been reduced to a bare minimum for our defenders. And the units and divisions engaged in combat in Myrnohrad are supplied via logistical routes through Pokrovsk. That's why the enemy's idea and plan are clear and obvious, and it is here that the heaviest fighting is taking place. The enemy controls most of the city of Pokrovsk, the south and the center, and they are trying to carry out such actions, as well as gradually encircling it, tightening the ring around Myrnohrad. If you look at the map south of Myrnohrad, our units are holding the defense there, and this part of the defensive lines and areas for Myrnohrad is the most difficult because they are in a semi-encircled position, and under such conditions it is very difficult to carry out their tasks. Therefore, in addition to Pokrovsk, according to their plans, at least of an operational, if not strategic nature, there is a line that we have discussed with you many times, Kostiantynivka, Drushkivka, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk. That is why around Kostiantynivka, which they see as the next line of defense, the intensity of fighting is also increasing, and they are trying to seize the city itself with separate groups, Viktorova Tosia, and then further, basically following their usual algorithm of actions in this area. They are trying to implement the same approach here in Kostiantynivka. Well, there are a number of other areas as well, and the situation in Zaporizhzhia is quite complicated. But if we need to characterize each sector qualitatively, each area overall, we understand that our units and divisions are making tremendous efforts to hold back the enemy's advance. Alexander.
Alexandrovich, you've already touched on the situation in the southern directions. Let's talk about this in a bit more detail. What's happening there? And by the way, what's happening, for example, in the area around Kupiansk? We know, and I sincerely hope that our attentive viewers have already clearly noticed, that the brave Ukrainian soldiers and their dedicated general staff in particular are consistently required to spend quite a considerable amount of their valuable time on debunking these fakes from Russian propaganda, like claims that they've captured yet another settlement. For example, Kupiansk has supposedly been captured several times already, and as for Pokrovsk, the Russians have been successfully capturing it for several years now, over and over, but nothing has really changed. What is currently happening in more detail on the southern fronts and in the area of Kupiansk as well, where Ukrainian defense forces have managed to cut the Russians off from their supply lines?
Yes, we are now smoothly moving on to analyzing the supposedly completely encircled and defeated Pokrovsk, and to a very similar situation in Kupiansk. However, it is clear that in both cases this does not correspond to reality. The particularities regarding Kupiansk from the perspective of combat operations, as you correctly noted, lie in the fact that in the northwest, there are ongoing battles aimed at cutting off the logistical routes of Russian units and formations operating in the north and center of the city. In other words, conducting combat operations requires proper logistical support, and here they are facing problems. They are trying to create the same kind of chaos. You see, everywhere there is a struggle for logistics concerning our group, the groups located to the east, the encirclement pocket, and supplying them across the river. This is quite difficult. There used to be bridges in Kupiansk, but now there are crossings being organized, which creates difficulties. But overall, our defenders units here are taking a more active stance, conducting raids and corresponding clearing operations in the center. And they are also engaging in combat operations, again, in the northwest, in order to cut off the enemy's logistics and worsen the condition of those units and formations that still remain in the north and center of this city. As for Zaporizhzhia, intense fighting continues along the line of contact, both in the west. This is the Orikhiv direction, where the enemy is present. They have already captured Kamyanske and Plavne, and now the fighting is taking place in Stepnohorske and Primorske. With this western encirclement, the distance to Zaporizhzhia is already up to 25 kilometers, but the advance is stalling. They are trying to organize an encirclement of Stepnohorsk and Plavne. They are not succeeding, but there is intense fighting around this area. There is a separate direction toward Huliaipol. They have barely advanced toward our fortified area there, which is a logistical center. They are trying to send separate groups to the outskirts. In Huliaipol, once again, there is intense fighting. There, it seems our defenders have received some reinforcements and resources. And there is a struggle to stabilize this direction, to halt such actions and break their plans.
Again, despite rather loud statements from the Kremlin about Russia's supposedly inevitable victory, which we've heard many times before, the actual offensive is progressing very slowly. This is also noted by analysts from the Institute for the Study of War. If the Russian army continues to advance at its current pace, the complete capture of Donetsk region might not happen before August 1927. Let me remind you, this is an analysis of the situation from the analysts at the Institute for the Study of War. In Pokrovsk, the Russians are advancing only 120 meters per day and control about 66% of the city after 118 days of fighting. The Institute for the Study of War also notes that the Kremlin is trying to create the impression that its supposed successes are inevitable in order to put pressure on both Ukraine and the West. Everyone, of course, understands that these stories about 120 meters per day and about percentages of control are all rather relative. This situation is quite dynamic. It changes very quickly. Overall, I've also seen maps that clearly show just how, let's say, well, it's obvious that for us, all of this means our lives, the lives of our defenders, the lives of our citizens, it's our land, our homes. But again, if you present this as an argument to the West as well, then these are really quite insignificant. It's not even right to call them successes. How is all this perceived in the West right now? How much do they really understand the true nature of the situation? After all, there's a reason people say that these are significant arguments after all, no matter what, in any negotiations, whatever they may be called. These are always arguments from the armed forces of Ukraine.
Absolutely, but there's also the question of who, when, and how presents these arguments or the actual objective situation on the front. Well, I mean, the leadership, primarily the political leadership. The Americans as well. B.G. Vance, we remember, stated that he knows what's going on in the White House, specifically, I think, even in the Oval Office. Yes, the very famous Oval Office for various reasons. So perhaps it's this environment. He was inspired, where he argued that they know the situation, at least because they follow Instagram and they assess the situation very quickly and briefly. So if you look at it this way, well, they are very busy people, or the president's entourage is so highly professional that their special agencies, intelligence, and so on, taking into account such approaches from their political leadership, even tried to make short little videos. I'd even say not really videos, but something that, due to their busyness, they could watch and quickly assess the situation. And sometimes they even send a minister, a young one, who has already become an advisor on issues related to Ukraine defense and the army of the DPR, of a senior lieutenant like that, who, together with his generals, was here in Ukraine assessing the situation. And despite the fact that I think they showed him everything, and I even know that the top military leadership reported everything to him, he still made such a controversial statement. It is known that the current situation makes it clear that the coming year will be a grim one for Ukraine. Although later Rubeva denied it, and then, so to speak, it all turned into purely American information activity and propaganda. What am I getting at? That it's important to distinguish things, and it's very useful for every one of our citizens to practice information hygiene and prevention, not to allow everything to get mixed together, especially when it comes from propaganda sources, first and foremost, of course, from the Muscovite, Russian ones, but really from any source. Even from other countries and even from our allies, as we can see, this is very useful. And that's why even when the situation at the front is difficult, it's important to know it objectively and not to fall for provocations from certain sources like the tired from supplying arms to Ukraine U.S. Press Secretary Levitt, the president of the American economy, and others like DJ Vance, who is constantly sifting through information about Ukraine on Instagram around the clock and so on. In other words, we need to approach this critically.